Stakeholder Ambassador at TMC, and I will be facilitating this webinar today. From TMC, we also have our Executive Director, Sophie Mather, and our Head of Research, Dr. Kelly Sheridan. So please continue to submit your answers to this Mentimeter throughout the webinar. If something pops into your head, just jot it down and we'll be able to discuss the answers during the middle of this webinar. So let's get started. So in this 1 hour session, we will be addressing 10 key questions that we are most often asked by people working in the industry. I think it's really interesting that we have a really broad cross-section of roles present with us in the webinar today, from product developers, material technologists, chemists, activists, environmental specialists, and it's a real pleasure to have you all with us. So we'll be simplifying our understandings to create a clear overview of the problem to date, where we are now, and what we need to achieve in terms of next steps. So just a bit of admin, there will be time for a Q&A at the end. We are recording, mics and cameras are off, but please do interact on the chat function. Okay, so I'd now like to hand over to our Head of Research, Dr. Kelly Sheridan.
Thank you, Anna. Welcome everybody to TMC's public webinar. I think the first question we need to start with is address the issue of what are microfibres. It might seem an obvious one to some people, but there's real ambiguity surrounding the term, and often lots of different phrases and terminology is used to describe them, some of which are on the screen here that we have had responses to this question that we've posed to people in the past. A microfibre, specifically from an industrial perspective, is a very specific type of fibre. But more broadly, beyond the industry, it's known and understood to be different things. First of all, let me start with what is a fibre. In a textile, a fibre can be described as really the smallest and simplest form of matter that is used to make up that textile. That fibre from the textile can be broken off and it can form a fibre fragment. But most people tend to think about microfibres as being microplastics. And a microplastic specifically is a form of matter that is made of plastic, and that is then linked to a plastic fibre or a synthetic fibre such as polyester or acrylic. At TMC, our remit is within the fashion and textile industry, and we address microfibres as a whole. And microfibres, what we term them as, are those fibres that are synthetic or otherwise that encompass a textile fibre that is broken or released from a garment or other form of textile. Next slide, please, Anna. So where are they found? We know that lots of studies that you've probably heard about, that they refer to microplastics or microfibres. Again, the terms are used interchangeably often. They've been concentrated around water environments, in our oceans, in our seas, but they've also been found in our homes, our places of work, and falling out the Paris atmosphere. They're in our soil, they're in our drinking water, inside marine life, inside fish species, in mussels, in plankton. And most recently this year, a study was reported of them being found in human sputum. Essentially, that's not a very nice term, but spit that comes from people who've been asked to spit who have diseases with their lungs. So quite simply, they're everywhere. Next slide, please, Anna. It brings us on to a more pressing question, and that is, why is this a concern? Although the initial concern was that fibres were found in water pathways through domestic washing, which then impacts on the ocean, we now understand that this is more complex. We understand from the places that they're found that the pathways must be beyond just the water pathways through air that are leading them to find them in terrestrial environments. But what are the impacts? Impacts can be both physical, but also toxicological. We know that they're affecting human and animal health, including marine life, as just described, but also that they're airborne, which being found in human sputum quite recently indicates that maybe we're inhaling them. We know that they're found in our homes. As they accumulate, the potential impact to human and animal life will increase. From that impact, we know that shape is important. There's some studies that say it's the actual shape of a fibre that causes harm. So that's regardless of its type. What is often also overlooked are toxicological effects from additional chemicals or dyes. If you look around the room that you're sitting in, take a look outside. Most clothing that people wear and most textiles you see are coloured. That means they have been dyed. More often than not, that will be synthetic chemical dyes. What's the impact of them? Quite simply, there's a lot to really understand when it comes to the impact of microfibres, and that's what we're trying to understand. Next slide, please, Anna. This isn't a slide that has gone wrong. This is a slide that's meant to represent microfibres being a largely invisible pollutant. A lot of this work started from the observation of large plastic items in oceans, such as plastic bottles or plastic carrier bags. It's taken a long time to realise that the pollution in our environment in terms of microfibres is real and needs to be addressed. But it's still largely unknown because they are of microscopic size and therefore largely invisible to people. So where do they come from? We know the fibres are released from textiles, and that is across all of them. That is regardless of whether textiles are formed from natural fibres, synthetic fibres, from items such as fleeces to t-shirts, high fashion, sportswear. The reasons why they are shed are complex, but the key factor is that they're shed from all textiles. Next slide, please, Anna. And whilst we know that they are shed from textiles, at what stage does that happen? Well, that happens from their inception. During manufacturing processes, microfibres are released from textiles. When you're wearing those textiles, when you're washing them, when you're walking around and moving your arms, fibres are being fragmented from the textile and lost out into the atmosphere. Anything you sit on, you are leaving fibres behind. And also at the end of use, fibres or clothing items, when they are come to the end of life, will also have an impact on releasing microfibres to the environment. I'm going to hand you back over to Anna.
Thank you, Kelly. Right, so let's have a look at the results. of our audience question. So I'm just going to stop sharing and I shall share my other screen. We've had lots of input here, so thank you so much for your engagement. Okay, so here we are with the results of what part of the microfibre issue brings you here today. So I think what's interesting here is we have no one standout issue. It's really a broad array of lots of different things, which I think speaks to how complex and varied this topic is and how many different kind of spheres it affects. We can see plastics, oceans, health, regulation, all of these which are so relevant to the microfibre topic at the moment, and as our understanding continues to develop. Now that we've got some more answers coming here in, water is featuring a little bit larger. What you'll see with this word cloud is the more that one answer, the more times one answer is submitted, the larger the word grows. So we can see here that water is a concern in relation to microfibres, and it's often the thing that first springs to mind when you think of fibre fragmentation and what we know about microfibres so far.
I think, Anna, if I could maybe jump in here, I think, because this is really fascinating to me, because it really gives us a pulse on people's interest on the topic at this point in time. I think they're darting about a little bit all over the place, but I think one that particularly jumped out was natural fibres. I know we're quite often associated, or people seem to think, because in the early stages of microfibre release, there was a lot of association to synthetics, but I think through Kelly and her team, a lot of the research now is starting to scale the amount of understanding around natural fibres. And I think just because it's natural doesn't mean to say it's not harmful. So that's an interesting one for me. Low impact materials, really interesting here, because I think, you know, as far as TMC is concerned, you know, what we don't want to do is work in a silo, but work in the larger sustainability agenda and making sure that what we're understanding here actually supports some of the other key sustainability topics at the moment. I don't know if anybody else on the TMC team has got some thoughts or anything they want to interject with at this point. Yeah, legal situation. Yeah, I think next week we've got, just plugging another webinar that we're doing with our signatories around policy. So that's something that's very high on our agenda as well at the moment.
I think a couple of issues that are coming through here, Sophie, that kind of spark my interest are regarding that root causes and textile issues that we need to really bring this back to understand.
Yeah, definitely. Be talking a little bit more about that later on in the webinar. So yeah, key to pull that one out. Thanks.
Solutions, that's the easy bit.
Yeah. Recycled spun polyester. I think that one, somebody's been very clever pulling recycled and spun together. And I think they're both areas that we have looked at. Yeah, recycled was an area that I was particularly fascinated in the early stages, because, you know, obviously as the industry is scaling the amount of use of recycled, it's really important that we don't provide you know, have a bigger issue by utilising fibres that maybe fragment more. Concern for health, education. To be an accredited lab, please message Aisha. She's background and would love to hear from you. So if you are interested in becoming an accredited lab, Aisha is currently working to increase the accredited labs that we actually work with. So really fascinating. And I think maybe, Anna, I don't know if you're going to be keeping this open as we go through the webinar, and I know the TMC team would be very interested to see the results of this as we get out the other end of the webinar. Yeah. Thank you, Anna.
Absolutely. Please keep submitting your answers there, and we can certainly come back to that at the end of this presentation. And I think another thing that I pull from those answers is that hopefully we'll address those in these upcoming slides. So it's interesting to me to see biodegradation, you know, is one better than the other in terms of fibres? So let's resume these slides. Just bear with me one moment.
Thank you, Anna. On to the next slide. Yes, there we go. Okay, so yeah, great, thank you. I'm going to jump in now and talk a little bit about why TMC is so passionate about this. And I suppose as the founder of the Microfibre Consortium, I would love to talk a little bit about this because in 2016 was really when I first started to get engaged in the topic. And at the time, the core of the work was very much directed by marine specialists who were concerned, obviously, about what was coming out of textiles and finding its way into the oceans and into the marine life that was there. So a lot of that early work was about trying to prevent damage into the oceans, into the fish food chain. And a lot of it was done through filtering and understanding how fibres could actually be filtered out of water systems. And so because of that, the association to domestic washing was very high. There was a lot of work going on around how we could better understand fibres that were coming out of domestic washing machines. So that was really where it started. And I think as a very curious, very curious textile-based specialist, I was kind of challenged by that as a difficult topic that I really wanted to understand a lot better. I really felt that as an industry, those of us that really understood the textile engineering and how materials were put together could actually do something at that root cause level to make that change. And that is really what has been driving TMC from the early stages, is that textile driven science and the understanding of how we can make change as close to source as possible, because as much as filters are great, they will only affect a certain amount of fibres out there, and we really want to nip it in the bud as close to source as possible. So yeah, very, very curious and challenging the topic from the beginning. So curiosity really drives us in finding that simplest root cause solution, and it still remains consistent through everything that we do here at TMC. So we are a team of very passionate people, very passionate, innovative textile scientists that really don't, you know, we're not satisfied by the status quo. We're always asking, you know, why at every single level in what we're doing. And mad as it might seem, but we always seek to look at opportunities in the impossible. And as you saw on that slide that a number of people thought earlier on we had a technical issue, it wasn't. It was Kelly pointing out that this is an invisible issue. So, you know, that was something that drove us in the start, was just to ensure that even though it seems like it's invisible on the outside, the implications of it are actually really important and something that we should be addressing. So we have no crystal ball, really, with regards to this topic, but we do watch the research and we see the trends of what is happening, and we know that this isn't going to remain purely a water-based issue. And so when I think back to what I said before about looking at root cause change, if we can capture something at the root cause level, we're ensuring that, you know, things like fibres getting in through the air or impact in different ways is not going to be impactful to people or planet as well. Just finally on this slide here, just talk a little bit about the opportunities that we have as an organisation to bridge deep research with the commercial opportunities of brands and retailers. And that's really where TMC sits, in between very deep scientific research and the opportunities that brands, retailers and supply chain partners can actually maximise with that research. So lots of areas that for us to get excited about, and hopefully as we go through today's webinar, we can impart some of that enthusiasm and passion for the topic onto you as well. So next slide, please, Anna. So who is TMC? Who is the Microfibre Consortium? So we are a research-led sustainable NGO, and we convene the global fashion and textile sector to limit fibre fragmentation and microfibre pollution. So we do that in 3 key ways: by aligning the sector, ensuring a commitment from the people that we work with to work against this topic, against a set agenda. We are scaling as an organisation, and the scaling enables us to influence greater impact across the supply chain. And that is something that is really important for us. If you can imagine that every fibre fragment that comes out is tiny, it's invisible in places. To make that impact, we really need to engage across the sector to make sure that we are working together to find the best possible solutions. We also work to understand what is happening here. So developing root cause understanding, really getting back to the basics and looking at different elements of the supply chain to see where we can make a difference there. And then finally, in mitigating, really delivering sustained action and measurable impact. And you'll see more of that as our progress report comes out later this year, as the true impact that is being made against the work that we're actually doing. Next slide, please, Anna. I think that's handing back to Kelly.
The mute button, always. So what have we learned so far? We know for sure that the microfibre issue is not only related to synthetic fibres, but all fibre types, because all fibres shed from textiles. We know that the composition is not the only factor that affects microfibre release or fibre fragmentation. So we know, for example, that there are multiple drivers. We know that the fibre type does play a part, the draw ratio, material construction, the dyes and chemical finishes seems to have a factor in what I would describe as sheddability, the rate of which fibres are lost from a garment. Friction also plays a part, and how it's worn. Aging is another big question about how fabrics are used and worn over time, and their effect, the effect that has on fibres as they are released. Of course, we raised before the different stages that we need to be aware of during manufacture, wear, and that end of life. There's a lot of discussion at the moment about biodegradable fibres. It's an interesting solution, but for TMC and TMC's position, it's not a solution that is the answer today. And the reason for that is a lot of the biodegradability studies that have been performed are performed in very specific environmental conditions, in which a fibre or a biodegradable fibre is found to biodegrade in that particular scenario. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it will be biodegradable in a real life scenario. Also, in terms of biodegradability, a lot of the studies that are conducted do not look at the toxicological impact of the breakdown of said fibre. So until that is better understood and more thoroughly researched, we don't consider that to be an option at the moment. Often what is claimed is that if natural fibres, because of the very nature of that being natural, they will naturally biodegrade. But if we take cotton, for example, cotton in its raw natural state may biodegrade, but by the time that cotton fibre has been processed to be a fibre to be used to construct a textile, its cellulose backbone is completely different than its natural state. That means it's no longer in that natural form, and therefore its biodegradability will change. Added on top of that are those chemicals and dye finishes that we talked about before that we need to fully understand the impact of. There's still a lot of knowledge gaps. We need to generate much more scientific data, and our understanding needs to be scaled. The variables of what we're describing and the complexity is of the fabrics and the textiles that we're studying, in addition to the broader research remit of biodegradability and toxicology, on top of the speed at which the topic is accelerated in terms of people's agendas, has made this a really, really complex. There's a lot of variability across the research environment of microfibre and their pollution. Where existing data is often siloed, it's performed by changing one variable and comparing it directly to the next. But that's not necessarily how a textile is put together. It's a complex thing with multiple variables all having a role and impacting on each other. There's also lots of different methodologies that are conducted, and so it makes it really, really difficult to be able to take a step back and say, actually, these are the key drivers and these are the key effects. And so we need to come together as an industry, because this is a really complex and large topic. And only by coming together and having an aligned approach will we have any chance of really finding real solutions to the problem. Over to you, Sophie.
Thank you, Kelly. Next slide, please, Anna. So I'm going to cover some of the points that, or touch on some of the points that Kelly just made as I talk a little bit about how TMC addresses this issue. And I wanted to do that through one of our infographics here, actually. So a lot of you that are aware of TMC from the early days will know of TMC as developing a consistent, aligned, an aligned test method, the TMC test method, and that very much became the core of the work in the early days for TMC. And that really gave us the ability to understand, as Kelly was saying before, really intrinsically how this is being affected at different stages of a material. So we can test the material and understand what the fibre loss is and compare it to other materials to start to build this kind of story, this picture of where fibre fragmentation is actually being triggered from. So that was very much the core of the work in the early days. And it really helped us to compartmentalise fabrics and see this as an issue that wasn't just about laundry. As I said at the beginning, there was a lot of focus on domestic washing machines and what was coming out of our domestic laundry in the early stages. But once we had the TMC test method, we could have that consistent approach to understanding about materials from that kind of apples to apples situation. And this also enabled us to get back to the real driver, the real passion behind TMC, and enable us to look more closely at what was driving that root cause loss in the first place and how we could use that to influence change. So when I look at the infographic and I see how it actually relates to what we're doing today, you can see in the top here the people and the planet being the impact that we are working towards. So we always keep that in vision as we're doing our work. We want to make sure that the impact that we're creating at the planet level and within society is reduced further and further through the work that we're actually doing. Leading into that, you've got the pathways which we've touched on at a few places through the webinar today. And those pathways are through air, water and land. And those pathways are very much driven from the textiles and the fibres that are coming out of our clothing products. So as Kelly touched on in the previous part, she talked about the various different life cycle stages of the textiles and how that influences fibre loss. And that very much drives a lot of the work that we're doing. And on this infographic here, you can see the different coloured sections from fabric composition through fibres and yarns, fabric construction, coloration and finishing, very, very interconnected and interrelated with regards to the specific fibre loss that comes out of different materials. So you might have, say, for example, fabric A that is of the same composition, same fabric structure as fabric B, but they might have been dyed differently or finished differently, and those will have different amounts of fibre loss. And TMC is very much driven to kind of understanding how those differences are actually influencing fibre loss at the end. So those are the different stages which are affected by how a material is designed and developed, and also how it is produced in commercial production. So a lot of our work is focused to the design and development community, whether that's designers, product developers in brands and retailers, or R&D teams within supply chain partners, but how we can really understand how those materials are put together in the first place to understand what the loss is that is coming out. So preempting any fibre loss through the work that we're doing through fabric development and understanding the fibre loss through the testing. The second part of that is through responsible manufacturing, and we work a lot with people like ZDHC and supply chain partners directly to understand how we can influence change on the factory floor. So there's a lot of work we're doing there to look at suitable filtration at various stages in production to prevent any production loss from getting out into water systems, etc. So very much in a very quick snapshot as to kind of the areas that TMC is actually looking at here. But I think the best thing to do is also to direct you to our roadmap, and hopefully I shall be able to pop into the chat a link to our roadmap, which was the agenda that we put out last September when we launched the Microfibre 2030 commitment and roadmap. It was an agenda to be used across the industry with various different milestones and targets to make sure that there was one agenda that everybody was working towards. And so far, the response to that has been really positive, and it's something that we hold ourselves accountable to as we take this topic forwards. So hopefully that will be going into the chat, and I do encourage you to have a deeper look at that and understand more directly what the agenda is and maybe how you can become part of that agenda as well. Next slide, please, Anna. So why is a collective effort required? In the early days of TMC, we were a handful of brands, retailers, and various different research partners, but it was quite small. And we were realizing through the work that we were doing that if we wanted to support greater impact, coming together as a collective or as a consortium was going to be really important for progressing and expediting this topic. You can see on the screen there a list of our signatories. And as you can see, quite a diversity of different brands and retailers, researchers, supply chain partners. And that collective network is really super important for us. I've always been very much driven from the early stages to ensure that the suppliers have the same space and place within this community as the brands and retailers, because it's that collective power, that collective understanding between these different sorts of organisations that will enable us to ensure that the change can actually be possible. One of the things that I kind of wanted to bring up here is through the technical team and the work that Kelly's doing is we have a data portal that houses all the testing results and technical information about the materials that our signatories are testing. And it's quite interesting to see in there the diversity of different materials. So say, for example, there's a pair of tights in there. There's also a chenille jumper. There's also very high-end, luxury fabrics in there as well. To those individual brands and retailers, those materials are core to their material portfolios. And it might be that the brand that has the chenille would maybe never have a high-end wool material and vice versa. But that amalgamated information in our data portal is extremely valuable for us with regards to the data analysis and the dissemination of learnings back to the collective industry. And I think that's what really excites me is this scaling of information, this scaling of this collective enables us to see the opportunities in the gaps that one individual organisation would not be able to realise on their own. And I'm always really humbled, I suppose, when large brands come to us and say, we started this on our own, but actually we see the sense in joining the collective because we know that even though we're a big brand, we've got so much learning and opportunity by becoming part of the TMC and the work that you're doing there. So I think this collective really excites me, and I look forward to seeing how this changes and grows potentially as we go forwards, because I think with that we've got new opportunities for different materials, whether that's workwear or more home textiles or areas that we maybe wouldn't necessarily target, but we can get some really good understanding from. So next slide, please, Anna. So why should you care? We care. We get very excited about it, and we really want to make sure that the people that we work with have that same sort of feeling as well. So there's lots of reasons why you should care, but I wanted to summarise this in 3 key areas. Pressure is definitely growing. We see it. I've been on this topic since 2016. People were working on this way before I was. But we see increasingly pressure from various different groups. Policy direction is moving at speed. It's primarily at the moment based on plastics, and we really want to make sure that we avoid this kind of tunnel vision approach and give a science-based, more industry-driven view into policy direction. Consumers are becoming more and more aware and are holding their brands and retailers accountable for what they're doing in this area. And those brands and retailers turn to us for support and for help. And I think that's really important. You know, we've spent years where the consumer perhaps didn't care so much about sustainable issues. And now that they do, it's our responsibility to make sure we're providing them with the information and the products that they're actually requesting. Activists. There is a lively debate going on at the moment around synthetics, which is very much, they see at the core of this topic. As you can see from various parts in this webinar today, we don't see the microfibre issue as solely responsible from the synthetics industry. It is a topic that is being influenced by so many different parts of the textile industry, both natural fibres, manufactured cellulosics, as well as synthetics. And as we scale our data portal and the fabrics that are being tested, we'll understand more and more about the non-synthetics within this topic. I always talk about a no regrets approach, and that is really important to me, and I think to the larger industry as well. We can see where the sustainability agenda is going. There's some really key agenda items out there. And although in the early stages of this topic, it seemed to sit on its own, nobody really understood where it needed to go. We need to make sure that the microfibre topic is embedded in the larger sustainability agenda. What I hate to see happen is sometimes knee-jerk reactions put forwards to the microfibre topic. And with those suggestions, sometimes there's consequences. Take biodegradability that Kelly was talking about earlier. Yes, a lot of people have spoken about it as a solution to microfibre fragmentation. But what was to happen if a fibre partially fragments, but doesn't totally disappear, doesn't totally biodegrade? We end up with a much harder issue to solve, because we've got lots of tiny pieces that are smaller than initially they were. Or, you know, we go down a cotton route and we find that the toxicological impact is actually far greater than the actual fibre presence itself. And then the one that always gets me is the suggestions that come forward for additional washing processes in the factories. Yes, that is possible. Yes, that could reduce potentially the fibres that come out of the materials. But then what is the carbon impact? You know, those additional processes require energy to heat the water. They require energy to dry the materials. It's not a negative impact at all. And I think that's something that we very much care about, and we challenge everything that comes forwards for those reasons, and something that I would ask you to think about as well. Also, knowledge is lacking. I think Kelly touched on this earlier. We know that there's a huge amount more to learn. We have barely touched the surface, I suppose. I think everything we start to understand uncovers new areas as well, and that's something that we're always looking at, how we increase our knowledge, how we can increase our knowledge to support you, and make sure that the industry is making the best informed decisions. And it's that kind of balance between making the best informed decisions and working at the speed and pace that the industry is actually requiring. So that's really important for us. And then finally, your position can influence change. I am really humbled to see how many people have joined the webinar today, which is phenomenal. You obviously care because you have joined to understand more for yourselves and hopefully to pass on to your colleagues and teammates. But I think as individuals, we can all make change. You know, when I started TMC, I didn't believe that, you know, we could get to the scale that we're at today. And I think the topic has grown and grown. And I think we all have to believe in the elements of the industry that we can affect and how we just keep on and make sure that we keep talking to colleagues, to supply chain partners, making sure that other people can join in a similar sort of understanding. So ultimately, it's the collective that will influence change. And I think the more we can invite the collective to join us, the faster and the deeper this can actually go with regards to making change. So that's it from me. I hope after these 10 key points that Anna has outlined in this webinar today, you get some basic understanding to help you on your journey of understanding. And I think at this point, I'm going to pass back to Anna to help facilitate us through questions, Q&A. And I've seen Aisha's been monitoring the chat in the background as well. So hopefully we've got some great questions to come forwards to the team.
So I've been monitoring the chat as we've been discussing this webinar, and it's great to see the mad engagement that we've had. It's great to see how you were all very interested in the topic. I think we should start off with the definitions of microfibres. There's been a few questions with regards to, is there a maximum length and diameter of what we discussed to be a microfibre? What fibre length is less than 5 millimeters? So I think Kelly or Sophie, that would be a really great question to ask you guys.
Sure. In terms of a fibre, it's generally characterised that it is much finer than it is, or it has a high ratio of length to thickness. The size of the length can be in theory infinite, so it doesn't matter the length of the fibre. Going from a traditional, what you would describe as a textile fibre, to that really specific industrial definition of a microfibre, that's purely in relation to the thickness of the fibre. I hope that, have I answered that question right, Sophie? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it makes sense, and I think everybody's muted, so I think Aisha's monitoring the chat. So I think yeah, as far as I think you've answered that very well. And I'd say if anybody is feeling that their questions aren't answered as fully as you would like, you have an opportunity to reach out to us separately or pop another chat into the box for Aisha to bring it back to the collective team. So thank you. Aisha, maybe have you got another one for us?
Yeah, so we've had a lot of questions on the discussion between recycled polyester and virgin polyester. So one of them is there any evidence that textiles manufactured from recycled fibres have a different release rate to textiles manufactured from virgin fibres? So I think there might need to be some follow-up on that, because we do a lot of research on the difference between recycled and virgin fibres. However, Kelly, do you want to kind of give a summary overview of what's been done before?
I think it's a really important question, and one that requires more research to fully answer. We are investigating that in a bit more detail here at TMC, so through the fabrics that are signatories or testing. But there has been some studies out there that indicate recycled polyester fibre will fragment at a greater rate than virgin polyester fibre. So I think this is what comes back to Sophie's no regrets approach. Before we all jump on the bandwagon and move to the recycled option, are we really sure that that's not going to have a negative impact elsewhere? As I said, there is some research out there that indicate that recycled polyester will fragment easier. But again, it's one study, it's a siloed study, and I think there needs to be more research conducted before we can take a firm position on that. I can put the link to the paper in the chat actually, and that might be interesting to people if they want to read it for themselves.
I think the other thing to interject there, Kelly, I know from some recent conversations you and I have had as well, is a lot of our signatories are in a position where they're not actually using 100% recycled polyester. So I know when we've put some calls to actions out to signatories for materials, it's quite difficult when we've got, if we go back, I don't know, Anna, if you're able to go back to the infographic page and you look at the different elements of it. Yeah, thank you. So if you've got various different compositions going into a material, it gets very difficult to analyse fully exactly what those contributing factors are. So you don't know if the differences come from the composition, the size of the fibres and yarns themselves, or the fabric construction, etc. So what we're looking for all the time when we're bringing fabrics in for testing is comparable data. And I think even though we are scaling, sometimes the differences in materials that are coming through make it quite difficult to actually analyse it. So if there's anybody out there that has purely 100% recycled materials, again, I think we'd love to hear from you, wouldn't we, Kelly? It's always good to have those materials in for comparison.
Okay, so we've also had a few other questions with regards to biodegradability. So one of them is, how does biodegradability sit with the notion that clothing needs to be designed for durability and longevity?
Golly, okay. I don't know if that's necessarily one that sits within this this webinar. I think, is there anybody, well, maybe that needs to sit in the circularity conversation rather than a fibre fragmentation one. I know in the very early stages of some biosynthetics that I worked on, they were breaking down while in use, so that, you know, they weren't necessarily fit for purpose. But I would suggest that probably, not wanting to pass the buck, but I would say that probably needs to go into a circularity conversation rather than fibre fragmentation.
We've also had a few questions with regards to the test method. So is there a test method to determine microfibres and how these are quantified? So I think I can talk a bit about this because I work quite closely with the TMC test method. I've also just dropped a link about the TMC test method, and we have developed a test method which determines the quantity of microfibre loss from fabrics that we measure. And in the link below that I've just posted in the chat, you'll be able to see an overview summary of the work that we do. However, does anyone want to discuss further about how the test method kind of interlinks with that data portal that we also spoke about? Because there's been a few people wanting to know a bit more about everything.
I would say, Aisha, I think we've got a few minutes still for questions here. If you're able to give maybe a very top line view on the test method, how it works, like the philosophy behind it for anybody that is new to it, and then further information in the links that you've provided, I think could be helpful for people.
Yeah, so we've developed a TMC test method, and within this it is the aim is to determine the amount of microfibre loss from fabric. So within this, we are trying to kind of mimic a domestic laundering process in a lab environment. So we'd have a fabric sample, where we'd put this through a simulation of a domestic laundering process. And then we're able to actually measure the mass of microfibres lost from those fabrics, and also gained on the filter. So within this, we can kind of determine how much microfibres is actually being lost. And we're able to do this with any sort of material. So polyesters, natural fibres, synthetic fibres. And within this, we then kind of collect all of that data and house it in our data repository, where we're able to analyse the amount of microfibre loss from fabrics. So that's kind of a very brief summary of the test method. I'd be happy to discuss further with anyone if they have any more specific questions with regards to that. I've dropped my email in the chat as well. So does that kind of give an overview for you, Sophie?
Yeah, no, I think you've done a super job there. He's given people some great method. I think also to say that as we developed the test method, we didn't do it in isolation. There was a number of organisations that came together. So we had various round robin testing where we took our method through, I think it was 12 different labs to make sure we got that reproducibility and accuracy of the method. And now we sit very much aligned to 2 other key methods globally, so the AATCC and the upcoming SEN method as well. And I think also, Aisha, there's some information you could maybe direct people to on the Eurotex website that shows the comparisons of those 3 methods for anybody that may be more familiar with one of the others and wants to see how similar it is to the TMC method.
Great. So there's some more questions popping into the chat. There's one from Julie, who is a manufacturer of an organic cotton sewing. Oh, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you, Aisha.
Sorry, I've just got some feedback. Who's a manufacturer of an organic cotton sewing thread. And she's asked, have there been any experiments to see if different sewing methods generate more or less microfibres? For example, in quilts, do more lines of stitching per square inch prevent microfibre release during washing? Which is quite an interesting question.
That's a really interesting question. Thank you for posting that. We don't, if you look at our roadmap, we are primarily focused around the textiles and the loss from textiles, although this does come up as a question from time to time. And I know we are going to be working with one garment manufacturer to look a little bit more at seams, but that's just that's work that's starting at the moment. But I think when we developed the TMC test method, there was a lot of work done looking at how we actually hemmed the edges. So the samples that go into the testing are of a certain dimension, and they have to be hemmed in a very, very specific way, which is outlined on the methodology, to ensure that there is continuity of sample preparation. And when we were doing that, there was, I would even go as far as saying there was years of exploratory work done then, looking at, cutting methods, seaming methods, overlocking, how many stitches per inch, etc., different threads that we used to influence loss in different ways. So that was a really robust piece of work. So again, Julie, I would suggest if there's further questions there, maybe reach out to Aisha directly, and maybe we can pass on some information there.
Another quite interesting question with regards to labelling is, in some recent regulations published by some countries, requires that if clothing contains more than 50% synthetic, a warning label is required. How such label can solve the issue of microplastic shedding? So I think
I'm happy to jump in on that, unless anybody else on the team wants to. I think what you're referring to there, Bruno, is some US legislation. I know California was proposing such labels a while ago. I personally don't necessarily believe in that sort of approach, because as we understand more and more about the topic, I don't think it's necessarily related to how much synthetic is in a product. It's very much related back to that infographic, the different elements, the different makeup. So it's composition plus fibre type, construction type, coloration, etc. So I think when we talk about a no regrets approach, yes, that is something that could happen. But what happens if 50% of that garment is made up of natural or man-made cellulosics? What other sustainability-based impacts will that actually create? The planet, we don't have enough land for the growing of cotton, for the farming of sheep, for wool, etc. So I think we have to look at synthetics in a responsible way, and we have to make sure that everything is fit for purpose, but doesn't have any unintended consequences. And my fear there would be that there would be some unintended consequences. So probably a very roundabout way of answering your question. I'm sorry, Bruno, but hopefully that gives some insight from the TMC perspective.
There's also quite a few questions with regards to the types of fibres and how they're made, and if this impacts the way they shed fibres. So, for example, does the amount of twist, for example, a crepe yarn, fragment less than other yarns? So it might be interesting to talk about the structure of fibres as well.
Kelly, is that something you're happy to take?
Yeah. I think there is some evidence to say that the twist does play a part in fibre fragmentation, but as we mentioned in the webinar sessions, a lot of these variables are combined as in one textile. So the complexity is to try and understand, first of all, what's the key driver. And I think from all of the fabrics that we have tested nearly, I think we have over 450 fabrics in our data portal at the moment that we've tested, that amount to over 5,500 individual test results. So we have a large collective of data, and our priority at the moment is try to understand that as the fabrics are in total, if that makes sense. So what is the key variable or variables that are driving that fragmentation? And once we understand that, we can, that science then leads us down a deeper research path to understand factors such as twist, as what you're describing. I think if we start just at looking at twist or just looking at coloration, and we look at them individually, we may gain some learnings there, but that's not real life, that's not complexity. We need to view it as overall, and once we have those key indicators, then we can let them lead us to the deeper research that's required. So I think in short answer to your question, yes, we believe twist will play a part, but to what extent yet, we're not sure.
I know we're coming up to time, and Anna's going to keep us very much to time today, I'm sure. So we've got 3 minutes, and there's one that does fascinate me in the chat, actually, which I think will be a really good one to finish on. Which types, sorry, is there any, I think it was any fabrics worse than others? And when I read this question, I always go back to the round robin testing we did in the early stages of the development of the test method. We took 3 polyester fabrics in for testing. We had a lightweight polyester base layer knitted, we had a midweight polyester fleece, and we had a heavyweight polyester fleece. And I was always amazed that the heavyweight polyester fleece had the best results out of all 3 of those materials. So as much as we can anticipate what results we're getting out, it's always down to the testing results to give us that true understanding. And I think in the situation of those 3 materials, what was very interesting for us is digging into the yarn types, yarn sizes, coloration methods, etc. And that had a greater influence than what we'd initially anticipated. So to answer that question, no, there's no particular obvious high shed materials to avoid. I think we will build more of that picture as we go forwards, but it is that accumulative data and the scaling of the data that will enable us to get closer to those sorts of conclusions. So hopefully that's a good question to end on. Please keep thinking about your questions. And I think, Anna, I don't know if we're going to be summing up the questions anywhere. It might be that we take some of them and put them out in some posts or something later, but I don't know if you are able to wrap this up for us, Anna.
Yeah, brilliant. I think that was such an interesting discussion to have there, and thank you so much for everyone who has attended today, shown interest in this topic. It's very encouraging to see that, you know, people in the industry are taking note and are committed to action. So please do get in touch with the TMC team if there's any questions that are still outstanding today. We'd love to hear from you, and yeah, I hope that you have found this informative and that we've been able to give you an interesting overview of fibre fragmentation. This has been recorded, and I will be distributing the link to the recording. So again, thank you all for attending and for your engagement today.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you to Anna and the TMC team as well.
Thanks very much, everybody.